The following is a Hoop Ball presentation. Welcome to the Fantasy NBA Today podcast.
No trade as of yet is the only thing I can think to yell here at the beginning of the podcast. There is nothing yet as of a little after 9 a.m. Pacific time on Jimmy Butler, although it sounds like all indications are that he will be traded in the next 24 to 36 hours. I just know. It's 9:10 right now, by the way. That's the time out here on the Pacific Coast. It's 9:10 a.m. as I hit this point, the beginning of the podcast, and I just know that by the time this thing is out, by like 10:30 or whenever it actually gets posted and so forth, like 4 minutes later, I just know Jimmy Butler's going to get traded, and then that'll be on tomorrow's show. So that's the way it goes. Maybe it'll happen during the pod. Bail out on whatever we're talking about and discuss Jimmy Butler. If something happens, it's going to be interesting. It'll definitely change the complexion of somebody. Although, as we said last week, and I maintain this, I think whatever happens to Jimmy Butler, it's probably going to be a good thing. Most of the destinations involved here, he remains an alpha. I don't see that changing a whole lot. I think the outlook is generally pretty positive for most of the current Timberwolves as they get broken up, almost regardless of who comes back. But again, we'll cover that again when we need to. It'll be soon, most likely. Welcome to Fantasy NBA Today, everybody. I am Dan Besbris. This is, of course, a Hoop Ball presentation. Hoop-ball.com is the website. At Hoopball Fantasy, at Hoopball Tweets. You can check it out on Twitter. I'm at Dan Besbris on Twitter. If you can spell it, you can find me. That's the age-old rule. DANBESBRIS is the spelling on that name. Thanks to everybody that's been listening. Listenership, big spike last week as we got into mock draft reviews. Huge spike on Friday as Brew, the great Aaron Brewski, back on the podcast after a little podcasting hiatus for our benevolent overlord here at Hoop Ball. He gave out 4 sleepers from the B150 on Friday's show. I thought maybe I could get him to do 1, and he just did 4. I think that's what happens when you let him save up. He had saved up podcast words for a while, and then they just all came coming out. They were flowing. I would strongly recommend checking out Friday's show. Really good insight into the methodology of the B150. Everybody knows the Brewski 150, Aaron's top 150 list. Of course, giving out 4 sleepers from the list. We talked about kind of the zigging and zagging of fantasy drafts happening this season. How everybody, for the first time maybe ever, everyone is hunting the next big thing. And what does that mean for those of us that have been trying to do that for many years? Do we go a different direction? Do we go the same direction but farther? There's a lot of different ways to skin a cat, as the old expression goes. It's a disturbing expression. That was a fun show on Friday. Here's what we got coming up on today's podcast. We got some contests going on at Hoop Ball. I want to talk about those. We've got some products for sale at Hoop Ball. I want to talk about those as well. We've got the industry mock draft, which wrapped up about a week and a half ago. It's time to start breaking down those results. We have Mike Bossetti of RaptorsRapture coming up on today's podcast to talk about minute projections for the new Nick Nurse-led Toronto Raptors. And that'll segue, by the way. We have one more team-specific guest coming up on tomorrow's show. That'll be Mike Pellichet. We'll talk Pelicans. And then by Wednesday, well, now wait a minute. Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here. I think Wednesday we're going to be talking to Russ Peddle, our old buddy. We always talk to Russ about the Raptors in the past. He is much more focused on the fantasy side of things this year. So it'll be a fantasy show with Russ on Wednesday. And on Thursday, we'll start talking to all of the different pros from that industry mock draft and get their take on how they picked their team, whether there were guys they were eyeing nearby to some of their picks. This will be a really nice insight, and it'll be a couple weeks long because I want to make sure each pro, at least that has time and the ability or desire to podcast, gets that time to really sort of dig in to where they drafted, who went where, the things we can learn from different pros on different websites. Everything is important. And so that's what's coming up really here over the next 2 to 2.5 weeks, and that almost gets us to NBA opening night, guys. Tomorrow is 3 weeks from NBA opening day. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. It's almost here. All right, first things first. I want to dive right into industry mock draft results. I want to do round 1 right out of the chute on today's episode so that none of you can say I ever put off the interesting stuff. Industry mock draft. Let me tell you who was involved in this thing and where they picked. Jonas Nader picked first. He's of Roto World. Alex Rickleen picked second. Alex, he's actually probably going to be the first or second pro you hear from. We talked to him late last week, so that episode is in the can. That was a lot of fun. He and I had been working on getting a pod together for a little bit, so it was good to finally see that thing shake out. He's at Fast Breaks Fantasy. He put out actually a sort of a short form fantasy podcast. Would be pretty cool for you guys to check that out. So Alex had the number 2 pick. Mark Roberts of Hashtag Basketball had the number 3 pick. Our own Eric Ong selected 4th in this mock draft. Kyle McCune, who, believe it or not, we're actually going to talk to today, not on this podcast, but it'll go into the bank. When you get to hear it is my choice. He, of course, of Basketball Monster. Matt Smith had the 6th pick, also Basketball Monster. The Welsh, you know the Welsh, Lord Welsh of In This League, our good buddies here at Hoop Ball. He had pick number 7. I had pick number 8. Ethan Noroff of Roto World had pick number 9. Josh Lloyd of Basketball Monster at 10. Scott Bogman, the other Lord, he's at 11. And Seth Klein rounded out. He was on the turn with pick number 12. This is a 12-team, 9-category Roto-style mock draft. And that is the order. Here's what we had in round 1. Nader took Anthony Davis. Alex Rickleen took James Harden. Karl Anthony Towns went 3rd to Mark Roberts. Steph Curry went 4th to Eric. Giannis 5th to Kyle McCune. Kevin Durant falling to number 6 in this mock draft. Matt Smith. Nikola Jokic at number 7. I took LeBron at 8. Kawhi Leonard at 9 went right behind me. Damian Lillard at 10 to Josh's team. Victor Oladipo at 11. And Paul George at 13. That is your first round from the industry mock draft. Not a ton of surprises. I know everybody likes to hear how the first round goes in mock drafts because those are the biggest and most fun names to talk about, but there aren't really a whole lot of surprises, especially not in an industry mock. Like none of those guys, Russell Westbrook is not going to go in the top 5 by accident in an industry mock. He's going to fall a little bit. He fell into the second round, early the second round, but the second round. Jokic is always going to be right on that bubble along with LeBron James in a 9-category format. Of course, he takes a little bit of a ding there. Kawhi is probably going to go a little earlier in an industry mock, and he went at 9, which is about where he's been going in a lot of these kind of pro leagues. You might see a league where people are a little bit more cautious. Perhaps he falls behind Lillard and Oladipo. I don't think he'd fall behind the Paul George, Butler, Wall, Kyrie, Paul, that grouping of guys towards the second round. Kawhi is clearly a better fantasy player than most of those guys. So I think the lowest you're seeing him go in these leagues where people really know what they're doing is like 11. And as early as about 8. I'd be very curious to see how some of the standard mock drafts, just with kind of regular folk, how those are shaking out. We'll see. I think we'll get a better idea of those when the calendar turns to October. But otherwise, in terms of this one, Steph maybe a little bit earlier than we've been seeing him going in a lot of drafts. He's been a guy that's fallen into that 6 or 7 spot. The last of the top-tier guys taken, and you guys all know, I've said it 1,000 times on this podcast, that I really like Steph. I think he's going to be a little pissed this year, frankly, that people are trying to bring up the injury-prone narrative again, and I think he's primed for a solid year. Anthony Davis in a 9-cat format, he's got to go first. James Harden, Karl Anthony Towns, both very reasonable 2 and 3 picks. I think you could go in either order with those. Giannis, Kevin Durant, Steph, those are the guys that seem to be going in that next kind of triple grouping Jokic is basically all by himself. LeBron is polarizing. I'm a little surprised, I guess, that he went behind Jokic in this draft, but I understand it. I think there's a feeling that he might dial it back a tiny bit with the Lakers, but he's a machine, and until we see the machine break in any capacity, then you sort of have to assume he's going to be pretty good. I would have rather had one of those top 7 guys. Like, I'll pretty safely, I think I can admit that LeBron was not the guy I was hoping for at 8, but 8th is sort of a weird spot. You hope that any of those other 7 guys fall one extra spot to you. You feel a little bit uncomfortable taking Kawhi that early, so you're sort of stuck. I don't like the 8th pick. I think top 7 is a pretty good spot to be in. Top 6 is really where you want to be. To me, top 6, you've got a certain select crop of guys. Then there's, like a 2 or 3 pack, and then there's another 2 or 3 pack, and then things get a little bit murky after that. Lillard and Oladipo, they seem to be going basically hand in hand in almost every draft, one before the other. The question is in which direction. And then Paul George kind of hanging around near the turn. If Westbrook misses any time with the knee stuff, whether it's at the beginning or even during the year, Paul could have himself a very strong fantasy season. He has the ability, if he could just shoot the tiniest bit better from the field, he could be the end of the first round kind of guy. So this is a pretty reasonable first round. As usual, no massive surprises other than maybe the order of like 4, 5, and 6. But that's not going to change a lot for your fantasy team. Because if you have pick 5, you're probably not going to get one of those top 2 centers. You're probably going to go a different direction, and you're going to have to look for a center in the 2nd or 3rd round. So that's the one thing you need to think about as you look ahead. The centers in the first round, 2 of them are up at the top in Davis and Towns. Jokic is mid-pack, and then you don't really get to another center that's consistently coming off the board until Joel Embiid. And in 9-cat, I still don't trust him as far as I can throw him. And then you work your way all the way down to the Drummond, Gobert, Capella chunk of guys. They all seem to be going in a grouping towards the end of round 2, middle of round 3, that range. We'll get to that later on in today's podcast. I want to take just a brief break here after talking about the first round of this mock because, frankly, the first round is the easiest, I think, to talk about. To let you guys know what's going on over at Hoopball, and there's some good stuff. It's not all things that you have to pay for, although a couple of those are out there. The draft guide right now is $15.99, but Hoopball is having a contest. The Hoopball Tweets Twitter handle, I should say, sent out a tweet late last week, towards the weekend, that basically said if they got 250 retweets, I can say... retweets. I'm going to leave that because I think it's fun for you guys to know that I'm actually an idiot. If I got 250 retweets, that they would unlock some massive discounts on the draft guide in the next coming days. I don't know exactly what they are or when precisely, but I do know that you have about a day left to try to get them there. So check out Hoopball Tweets. Scroll back to the 21st, so that would be Friday, and retweet that sucker, because if you're thinking about getting the draft guide or the season pass, you might as well try to unlock a discount on them, and then you can make that purchase on that day. The B150 gets added to the draft guide on October 1st. That is 1 week from today, so you're 1 week from getting the B150 in your draft guide. You don't have to do anything. If you have the draft guide, you will get the B150 in 1 week. There's other good stuff coming up at Hoopball as well. There will be more contests later on this week. I don't know exactly what they're going to be for, but I've heard rumblings that perhaps some Hoopball swag will be involved. I don't know if you guys got to see me wearing that sweet Hoopball t-shirt or hoodie last year on some of our podcasts, but maybe those will be flung about. Perhaps you can get yourself some Hoopball swag by participating in the contest. We got mock drafts going on at the Hoopball forums. That's hoop-ball.com. You click on the forums tab. There's just a ton of stuff going on right now. And maybe most importantly, Hoopball is always looking to expand. We want the best fantasy basketball minds. We want the best basketball minds. We want folks interested in podcasting on teams. We want folks interested on covering teams as a beat writer. We want folks interested in writing for fantasy purposes. If you think you can handle it, and folks, it is a grind. It's a ton of fun, but it's a lot of work. If you think you can handle it, if you want this to be part of your career or future, let us know. You can tweet at me. You can send an email to support@hoop-ball.com. There's a lot of different ways you can get in touch with us. Any one of them is a good way to do so. So again, the draft guide, $15.99, although we will be giving a coupon code out for it later on today's podcast. That'll be coming up in our segment with Mike Bossetti. I want to talk about round number 2 in the Hoopball Mock Draft, and then we'll segue into that interview. First time on the pod for Mike. He was willing to put up with me for a few minutes, which was very nice of him. Round 2 of the Hoopball Draft. Industry mock, I should say. You already know the order, so just flip it. Seth took Russell Westbrook at 13, then it went Joel Embiid and Jimmy Butler at 14 and 15. John Wall at 16. This is a lot earlier than he's going generally in 9-cat format, so Ethan taking a little bit of a flyer on him. Kyrie Irving fell to me at 17. I think that's a pretty safe spot for him. Chris Paul at 18. Drew Holiday was taken 19th overall by Matt Smith. Eric Bledsoe at 20. That's earlier than we're seeing him go, but again, we'll break this down. Chris Middleton at 21. Ben Simmons at 22. Kevin Love and Donovan Mitchell rounding out the second round of our 9-cat industry mock. Okay, a few thoughts on the second round, which to me is, for the second year in a row, probably the hardest round in fantasy NBA drafts. And I don't know why this keeps happening. I thought about it for about 5 minutes before I came on air today, which doesn't sound like that much time, but to just sit and think about something for a while, the clock goes slowly, real slowly. And the best I could come up with is that as soon as you pass the obvious top-tier guys, you get into this strange bubble of dudes that have proven they can be second-rounders, or even end-of-the-first-round guys, but generally don't stay healthy or have some sort of large wart on their fantasy value, or up-and-coming guys who haven't gotten there yet, but everybody just sort of wants them to. And I don't know why. I'd almost rather just take a third-round guy, because those dudes tend to be much safer these days. I don't think, by the way, that this is a trend that's going to stay forever. I think right now, just due to the length of the first round, meaning you legitimately have 11 out of those 12 guys that probably will finish in the first round. It's very clear who those guys are. And the dudes outside of it that have a shot to creep in, they're slim. Chris Paul, if healthy. Jimmy Butler, if healthy. Westbrook, if he fixes his free throws. There's really like 3 guys outside the top 11 that could move inside the top 11. To me, that's it. So anyway, we talk about the second round here. Russell Westbrook at 13. He's an interesting 9-cat grab. You can always punt turnovers a little bit. If his free throws stay bad, that's trouble. If his injury stuff crops up, that's trouble. But if he fixes the free throws and he goes Warrior style like usual, well, he has the ability to get into the end of the first round. We've seen it before. I just don't think that he has that same drive for the triple-double. I think that there is a different, he's always going to be going at max capacity all the time. So that to me is never a worry. Maybe a little bit of a worry if he's injuring himself doing so. But I think he knows better than to go for the triple-double every game right now. He has weapons on his team. They should be winning games. That should be the focus. Can he be hauled in? I don't know. I don't think I'm taking him in most drafts. He's a terrifying player to own because he can do a lot of damage to your fantasy team as well. But I also don't know that I don't know among the remaining names in this second round, I don't know who else really I would want at this spot. Joel Embiid went at 14. To me, he's averaging some of the most turnovers ever for a big man on a per-possession basis, and he still hasn't really played more than about 65 games in a year. The injury stuff remains a concern. And he might be really good this season. In fact, he probably will be, but 14 to me is too high in 9-cat. Jimmy Butler at 15, okay, this is a possibility. Maybe this is a guy I would have taken at 13 just because you know he can do it on a per-game basis. He's always right at that end of the first round kind of spot. If he gets moved to a team where he can do even more than he did in Minnesota and maybe not get ground into a pulp by Tom Thibodeau, maybe he lasts 73, 74 games this year. So I like Jimmy Butler. I think he's a good pick. And he still has that injury thing hanging over him where he doesn't really make it through a year, and he's not that old. He's just that kind of player and played for that kind of coach. It's a bad combo. John Wall at 16, yeah, it's just too early for me for 9-cat. I don't trust him as far as I can throw him. The turnovers, the field goal percent, too many holes in his game. Kyrie, getting Kyrie at 17 felt pretty good for me. You know, he's an injury risk as well. I think that they're going to try to keep him healthy for the playoffs, so I do think there will be some rest days mixed in for him. But in a roto format, I'm not that concerned about a rest day here and there, provided it actually keeps his body healthy overall. And he does most of the stuff that John Wall does, just without the bad field goal percent and with fewer turnovers. Yes, fewer assists as well, but I'd rather have Kyrie over John pretty much any day of the week right now. His fantasy profile is just better. Chris Paul at number 18, that's about where we've seen him go. There is a pretty intense fear that he can't play more than about 63 to 65 games during the regular season anymore. The Rockets gave him $40 million for the playoffs. They don't even really care about the regular season, but these guys want to be out there playing. So it's not like he's just going to sit. The question is, does he actually incur an injury? Or 2, or 3, or 4? The answer is probably. So this is probably about where he should be going because he's a top 8 guy on a per-game basis, but he's not going to play enough games to hit that mark on a totals basis. Drew Holiday at number 19. This is okay. We saw him, that first Yahoo ADP had him going at like 14 or 15, and to me that wiped out almost all of his value. 19, you get a little bit of it back, although I'd love to see him fall farther. You know, to me, he's a guy you look for towards the very end of the second round to create a little bit more of that profit margin. Eric Bledsoe right behind him in this draft. I mean, that's a guy we've seen fall into the 30s at times, and he went at 20 in this one. So, you know, somebody liked him. That was Kyle McCune really liked Eric Bledsoe. We'll get his take on why he grabbed him here as opposed to seeing if maybe he'd fall a little bit farther. But he's good. I mean, he's a safe fantasy play, so I can't argue with it. And again, because the second round is so freaking goofy, you know, I don't know how many guys there are that you're like, well, I would have taken that guy here, and then seeing if Bledsoe fell to me. Maybe just this next dude, and that's Chris Middleton, who I probably would rather have over Bledsoe. But the guys that went between, for Kyle here, between Bledsoe in the second and his third round pick of Miles Turner, the guys that went in between them are not necessarily guys that I would rather have over Bledsoe. Not obviously, at least. Ben Simmons went at 22. I think he's generally going too early. With what he does to a free throw percentage, it's going to be really hard for him to hit this mark. And he's not adding the three-pointers. He does a lot of other incredible stuff. Make no mistake, he is an unreal young basketball player. But from a fantasy standpoint, it's hard to hit this mark if you're really killing a team in 2 statistical categories. Kevin Love at 23. I'm okay with that. Like I've said before, I think Kevin Love, if he can last 65 to 75, somewhere in that neck of the woods, this could be a massive year for him. Donovan Mitchell at 24, not that excited about him in 9-cat. I think his turnovers are going to be pretty high. He's not a big assist guy. He's a scoring type. Awesome basketball player, though. Can't wait to watch Utah. Beginning of round 3. Oh, wait. You'll just have to wait a little bit. It's time to talk to Mike Bossetti, isn't it? It's the era of the guest, after all. I'm so pleased. I'm really enjoying myself these last couple of weeks. Not that the offseason wasn't enjoyable, but this run up to the season is just, it's a different beast. It's got the juices flowing. We're digging in. We're doing deep dives on teams. We're getting ourselves ready for the fantasy draft. And there is a team out there with a new superstar that is not the Los Angeles Lakers that a lot of us are talking about and scratching our heads and trying to figure out what sort of risks we should be willing to take. And that team is the Toronto Raptors. And here to put us all at ease or possibly terrify us, I don't know how this is going to go, is Mike Bossetti of RaptorsRapture.com. Mike, thank you so much for taking some time with us.
Thanks for having me on.
You can follow Mike, by the way, on Twitter at MikeBoSports. That is at MikeBoSports. You can also follow Raptors Rapture on Twitter. Just don't say it 5 times fast, at Raptors Rapture. Okay, so I think we'd be remiss if we didn't start with Kawhi Leonard, right? I'd be burying the lead a little bit if we circled Kawhi. He's your superstar. He's your guy. DeMar DeRozan, Jakob Poeltl had to go elsewhere to make room for him. But, I mean, here's the bottom line. When Kawhi Leonard is healthy, he's a top 5 player in the NBA, and not many teams can claim that. In fact, I think the number would be about 5. So that's got to feel pretty good for you guys up in Toronto, provided, there's the hope that he'll make it through the season uneventful.
Right, yeah. I think I've done a couple of these things so far, and every single time Kawhi Leonard is the first question that comes up, just because it is so important. And like you said, he's a legitimate top 5 player when healthy. He was a legitimate MVP candidate, and really the best player the team's had since perhaps in franchise history. I think that you could maybe argue peak Vince Carter and Chris Bosh was an all-NBA player, but you're talking when healthy, he's the best player that the Raptors have ever seen in franchise history. And DeMar DeRozan was great and Jakob Poeltl was great, but you're talking about a different class of player when you talk about Kawhi.
So do we think there is a possibility that Kawhi Leonard goes back to what we saw 2 years ago in San Antonio, just in terms of overall production and health? I mean, there's so many question marks swirling around him right now.
I think that's probably a little bit bold to say 2 years ago, because that was the best season he had in his career. I think maybe the season before that is a little bit more of a reasonable expectation. Also, I think that Toronto has more players around him this season than San Antonio did that year, and I think that his role will be a little bit smaller. So I think probably 3 years ago is the better year to look at if we're looking at kind of one-to-one comparisons.
So that was looking back at 2015. Kawhi Leonard averaged about 21 points. He was up around 7 rebounds that year, which I think might surprise some people. But still just crazy defensive numbers, just never turned the ball over. All of these things that for folks out there that are sort of perusing the fantasy landscape, he was still on a per-game basis inside the top 6. I mean, this is like... So the question really, Mike, I think that everybody is wondering is, what do those of you on the ground up there feel like you can expect in terms of games played? Is he going to be coming out gangbusters? Is he going to be playing with something to prove, or is he going to be saving himself to get that max contract?
I think that's the interesting question, right? If you're a fantasy owner, it's how many games does he play rather than how will he play in those games. I think that it's reasonable to expect him to play, upwards of 70 games if healthy. I don't think that the Raptors are going to rest him more than the Spurs, and I would guess after, 15 months off of basketball that he's ready to play once again, and he'll want to kind of play more than he has in years past with San Antonio, who's been notorious for limiting players' minutes.
Okay, so you're, I don't want to say gun to the head. I hate that expression, but Mike, you're in a fantasy draft, and you have the 11th pick in the first round. Would you spend your first-round pick towards the end of it on Kawhi Leonard?
No, I don't think I would. I think there's just too much of a risk with the injuries, and I don't see the upside of him being, one of those top 4-3 players in the NBA, because I don't think the volume's going to be there with Toronto. Like I said, I think there's just so many other talented offensive players that I think you might see a better offensive season from him thus far. But I don't think that the upside is there for him to be a top 3 player. And I think when the risk is as great as it is with Kawhi, that you want to have that kind of top 3 upside if you're wasting a first-round pick, or using a first-round pick, shouldn't say wasting.
100% agree with you on that one. I didn't want to lead the witness, something I've been trying to do a better job of on these interviews, but I'm totally with you. If you have a pick towards the end of the first round, you really can't afford to have a guy with that many red flags. If you're what I always say is, like, if you have Anthony Davis on your team already and Kawhi falls to you towards the middle or end of the second round, you could get away with it because you'll have another dude on your team who's, effectively worth like 3 other guys. But if that's your top pick, if you're looking at a guy that you don't know, that's to me too big of a risk to take, and I'm happy to hear that you agree with it. So let's move on to Kyle Lowry then, because he's kind of an interesting case study. He had been a guy that had worn himself out by the end of a couple of seasons recently, and then last year he basically made it through the year, which was kind of nice. He just didn't do as much. Is that the formula going forward? Keep him healthy, keep the minutes lower, let the bench do more work so Kyle Lowry will actually be available come playoff time?
I think it has to be, right? I don't see why. He played better this postseason than he had in postseasons prior. I don't see why you would all of a sudden go away from the formula that seemed to work. He was, I believe, 3rd in minutes the 2015-16 season, and then last year he dropped down to 46. So obviously that's a big difference for your fantasy lineup, but that's also a big difference on his legs. And I think it paid dividends last season, so I'm not sure why you would go away from it as a coach.
Yeah, looking at this most recent season, Lowry, 17 points, 5.5 rebounds, 7 assists per game, a little over a steal, 42.5% shooting from the field. Of course, he made 3 3-pointers a game. He was taking quite a few of them. Looking back at the previous year, again, by the way, talking to Mike Bossetti here of RaptorsRapture at Mike Bo Sports on Twitter. The previous year for Kyle Lowry, he was actually the number 12 ranked player in fantasy at 22.5 points per game, 5 boards, 7 assists, 1.5 steals on 46 and change percent shooting. Is there, sort of long-term here on a guy like Lowry, he's been closer to the 42-43 we saw last year in field goal percent. The 46 and change the previous season, that felt more like the statistical aberration. Is there a chance he could sort of push that number back up this year? Or, a guy taking 8 3-pointers a game, is he just sort of doomed to having kind of a lower field goal percent?
Yeah, and you saw last season he attempted less 2-pointers than he did the year prior. I think with Lowry, you're just not going to get the field goal percentage much higher than that based on the fact, like you said, he's attempting so many 3-pointers a game that he's kind of always going to have that drag it down. And obviously you hope with a more explosive offense this year that he'll get more looks and shoot even better from 3 than he did last season. But at the same time, you're only going to shoot so high from 3, and it's going to impact him, I think, moving forward as he gets older, to expect him to become more of a shooter, which will, again, help your 3-pointers, but then hurt you on the field goal percentage side. Yeah,
I was just looking at that number as you were talking about it. The 4.5 2-pointers he attempted per game last year was the lowest total for Kyle since the 22-game Memphis stint back in 2008-2009. So it's been a decade, and if you wipe that out, it will be the lowest for any full season since his rookie year, 2006-2007. So it does appear as though the trend is moving in that direction. I get the feeling from you so far, just to sort of put a little bit of a bow on the big names on the Raptors so far. In Kawhi and Lowry. Kawhi, you'd be looking more at as a second-round kind of guy if he could fall that far. Lowry, more like what we saw last year, which was a third-round value on a per-game basis, but a little bit better when you look at him playing 78 games instead of 60. Is that fairly accurate so far?
Yeah, I think Lowry also is a guy who I would characterize as a low-ceiling, high-floor guy, where I'm relatively confident that Lowry's going to put up numbers this season. I just am relatively confident he's not going to play a ton of minutes as well.
Fair enough. Okay, some of the other names that we've seen on the Raptors before. Jonas Valanciunas. Every year, Mike, we hear this is the breakout season. This is the year where Valanciunas is just going to go absolutely bonkers. And there hasn't really been that that official season yet, although from an efficiency standpoint, he was actually quite good last year and probably a bit underrated.
Yeah, when you look at his per minute numbers, they absolutely went up last season, but his raw numbers, because of the decrease in minutes, didn't have the same impact. I think that perhaps it won't be a breakout this season, a lot of statistics. I think that this year could be the year that you see Jonas finally start to attempt three-pointers consistently, and I would expect that to be a part of his game next season, which could obviously help you on that end.
Do you see the minutes coming up from 22 and a half at all? Or, over his career, we've seen 24, 28, 26 a couple times, and then last year was far and away the lowest for him. Or, is that what folks should expect now? A guy that can go out there and just go full bore for, about 11 minutes a half? Or is there a plan to maybe try to get him involved a little bit longer this coming season with no Pirtle around?
Yeah, I think he comes back up. I don't think he'll ever be a 30 minutes a game guy, but I think you could see him back up to that 26 number, especially with Pirtle out. The question is, does Greg Monroe work his way into the rotation? If he does, then I think you'll see him closer to 22. I'm not as confident in Greg Monroe's ability. I think that it will mostly be Jonas playing the center with Serge Ibaka being the backup center this season. So I would say that he plays probably closer to that 26 minutes per game. But at the same time, if Greg Monroe does get in there, then I could see it staying around that 22.
All right, let's talk about the host of other big men options then, since we talked about Valanciunas for a moment here. You mentioned Greg Monroe, the Moose. He's a Raptor. Bebe Nogueira, who, by the way, and I can't believe I forgot to bring this up earlier in the podcast. I live in West Los Angeles, and I saw Bebe Nogueira in a Ralph's supermarket about a half mile from my house. What the heck is he doing in my backyard? Do you know what he's doing down here?
Well, Bebe actually has not signed on for the next season.
Oh,
so,
that explains it.
So he's a free agent, so I'm sure he's in LA probably working on his game and hoping to get picked up. I would assume he's an injury away from being picked up. I thought he would return to the team this season, but they opted to go with Greg Monroe. So we'll see what happens with him. I'm not sure if it will be waiting for an injury or perhaps maybe even a trip over to Europe.
Interesting. Okay, well, Bebe was just getting something from the fish counter here at Ralph's in L.A. Okay, the other big men. Pascal Siakam, he's another guy that folks seem to be gushing about just because of his ability to sort of move. And then Serge Ibaka, who's been on this sort of slow train down from the apex back in his Oklahoma City days. How do the minutes get divvied up among all of these big fellas? Is there anybody that's going to push out in front of everyone else, or does it feel more like a split, or what feelings are you getting?
So I think that if I had to guess, it would be a three-man rotation between the two. I don't think Moose works his way in on a consistent basis. Obviously, that could be wrong. They brought him in for a reason over other guys, but they were comparing him against a lot of fringe roster guys, so I'm not sure why it's guaranteed he's going to earn minutes. As for Serge Ibaka and Pascal Siakam, I think that you can bet on Serge Ibaka as a more consistent person because he has the flexibility to play the 4 and the 5. There's been some whispers of a Pascal Siakam 5-man that I'm not totally buying. I don't think that they'll run that at least very often during the regular season. It just takes a wear on you. I think that if I had to guess the amount of minutes being played next season, I would say Serge Ibaka leads away with Jonas second and Pascal kind of nipping at the heels at Jonas.
That's probably what I would have guessed as well. The wing guys, that's the last thing I'm going to bug you about here on this show. And there are a number of them. And I'm gonna throw the guards in with the wing guys as well. Delon Wright, Freddie Van Fleet, Norman Powell, C.J. Miles. I believe you've got him for another year, right?
Right.
Yeah, C.J. Miles, Danny Green, who just came over from the Spurs, and OG Anunoby. That's a lot of mouths to feed for not a ton of minutes and shots. Is any of those guys? And this is something that I mentioned very briefly before we hit the record button. There were stretches last year where the Raptors basically had like 8 guys that were posting fantasy value. There's still a ton of depth on this team, but didn't it feel last year a little bit like those weird stretches were more a product of of blowouts, and so reserves saw a few extra minutes, so they kind of crept into the fantasy value territory? Or can any of these guys bust through and get a big enough slice of the pie to be fantasy relevant? Or, is it just the terrible problem, I'm sure, that Toronto is feeling right now of having too many good players?
Well, another portion of it is Coach Casey liked to run these 5-man bench mob units, which were almost like a hockey change, fittingly for a Canadian team, where he ran out, all 5-man bench units. From what I understand and what I've heard of Nick Nurse in press conferences, that doesn't appear to be the plan so far. So I would say the chances of a player kind of, getting a bigger chunk of the pie, as you said, is likely. If I had to put money on one guy who I think could see his minutes increase kind of exponentially, that would be OG Anunoby. He has the ability to play both the 3, and I think he'll play the 4 a decent amount this season. So I think he's the guy, if I had to bet on someone to earn more minutes than they did last season, I think he's the guy I would look at first.
That's an interesting. I've heard a lot of really good things about him. Is there an indication that the offensive game is coming along a bit?
So he's efficient, but that's the problem. His minutes will increase. I'm not sure how his usage while on the court will be impacted that much, because I think he's just, he's a complimentary player at this point in his career. He can hit the corner 3. He doesn't do a ton off the bounce. I think you'll see him grow a little bit, but I'm not sure you'll see next season him become a high assist guy or become anything more than a 3rd or 4th option on the offensive end.
It's not terrible to be basically like the next generation's version of Shane Battier. That could be worse, right? A guy who's just...
Yeah, that's a great comparison for him. I think he's someone that a ton of teams would love to plug in as their 4th guy. But for fantasy purposes, he's limited in the ceiling because he can only do so many things. But I don't think he'll ever hurt you in your percentages. He'll get a decent amount of rebounds. I would expect his rebounds to go up now that he's playing more power forward. And he'll get a couple steals and things like that.
Okay, here's the last one. I'll make this one a little bit of a tougher question, I guess. And it's more a season-long predictive sort of deal. Mike, your Raptors had just an awesome 2017-2018 season. Those stretches where the starters didn't have to play in the 4th quarter for like 2 weeks in a row was just, it was amazing. You were running everybody out of the gym. How does a team get itself back up to that level of motivation after the way a few seasons have gone? I love the Toronto Raptors. Every year in my damn playoff bracket, I pick them to advance, and every year LeBron stabs my bracket and tears it to pieces. So how does the team, from a motivation standpoint, is the addition of Kawhi enough to sort of get everybody back and ready to hit the reset button? You got some other good teams in the East coming up in Boston, in Philadelphia, and potentially even, I guess you could throw Indiana into the mix a little bit, although I happen to think they regress slightly. How does this Raptors team sort of get up to try to get near that 60-win plateau again, or is that not even really the goal?
I don't think that's the goal for this season. I think the team's already accomplished so much in the regular season and so little in the postseason that really anything they do is going to be met with the caveat of, yeah, well, we'll see in the postseason. So at some level, it doesn't totally matter. I think you certainly hope that with the addition of Kawhi Leonard, a new head coach in Nick Nurse and Danny Green, I think you hope that energizes a group, but at the same time, who knows? I think another thing that works in their favor is they have a lot of young players, and young players to me are more likely to, stay focused in on a night-in, basis rather than veterans who know how long the regular season is and are kind of resting themselves to play at that postseason. So I think that it's reasonable to expect this team to approach 60 wins, but perhaps not reach it.
I lied. I did have one more question. What can folks expect out of Nick Nurse's changes in Toronto? This one, I legitimately have no idea. I don't know the coach. It seemed like Dwayne Casey was someone who, for many years, I watched the Raptors get off to very slow starts in basketball games and then eventually sort of like will their way past the opposition. And then last year they just beat the hell out of everybody. Well, how does the mentality change under Nick Nurse?
So Nick Nurse is a guy who coached in England for a while and also coached in the G League for a long time. When he coached in the G League, he spent about half his time there for the Rio Grande Vipers, which is the Houston G League team. And they played at a pace which was, at the time, unbelievable. They played at an unbelievable pace and shot an insane amount of three-pointers. As we go, 8 years later, that doesn't look quite as crazy as it did then. It's not quite as jarring compared to the NBA, but if I had to guess what would happen with this Nick Nurse offense, I would say expect the Raptors to play at a faster pace than they did last season, and I would certainly say expect them to shoot more threes. There was an article last year about Zach Lowe where he went with the G League players and he counted -2 points for every mid-range jumper they shot. So I think you can really expect them to attempt to focus on corner three-pointers, and shots at the rim.
That sounds like the modern NBA. Mike Bossetti of RaptorsRapture, thanks so much, my man. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, and a last note here as Mike departs from the podcast, we are we're tying a coupon code for the Hoop Ball Draft Guide to every single guest we have here on Fantasy NBA Today throughout these weeks leading up to the NBA's opening night. Let's see here. Mike, what do you think? What should the coupon code be? Should it be Nurse or Kawhi or anything Raptors related? Something simple. What's on your mind?
Let's go Nurse.
Nurse. There it is. Nurse is the coupon code. That's $3 off the Hoop Ball Draft Guide with coupon code NURSE. Not Hello Nurse, just Nurse. Again, you can follow Mike on Twitter at MikeBoSports, MikeBoSports, or you can follow RaptorsRapture. That is self-titled on Twitter. That's nice and easy. RaptorsRapture.com is that website as well. Mike, thanks again.
Thank you for having me.
That was Mike Bossetti of RaptorsRapture. Thanks again to Mike for coming on the pod. We'll try to get him back as we roll into the regular season. Some thoughts on kind of how the Kawhi stuff is shaking out. Of course, if anything else happens on the Raptors front, you never know. I can bug him about that as well. A lot of people have subjected themselves to my bugging voluntarily. I'm not tying them down or anything. All right, let's talk about the third round of the industry mock draft, then we'll wrap up today's podcast. Picks 25 through 36, Rudy Gobert, Gary Harris, Andre Drummond, Clint Capella, Miles Turner, Devin Booker, Bradley Beal, Kemba Walker, Draymond Green, LaMarcus Aldridge, Kyle Lowry, and Marc Gasol. Rudy Gobert is a guy that we've seen bouncing around a lot in fantasy drafts. It's really hard to get a feel for where he's actually going to go in your league. He is, by all accounts, coming off a pretty good fantasy season on a per-game basis. I realize that's sort of a big if when it comes to predicting your fantasy value. On a per-game basis, he was number 30. That's despite having a number of games where his minutes were down artificially as he worked his way back from injury. 13.5 points, 10.7 rebounds. His blocks were up at 2.3, which was nice. Free throws were not too awful. They were pretty bad, and he took too many of them, which is what hurt. But at 68%, you can usually counterbalance that with one of the better foul shooters in the NBA. He shot a ridiculous 62% from the field. 0.8 steals to go along with everything else. So by all accounts, he actually had an okay fantasy season. He just only played in 56 games. He missed 2 months. Maybe a little, tiny bit more than that, I think, just in terms of overall time. If Rudy Gobert puts up top 30 numbers and gets into the 70s in games played, that's the kind of thing that can put you into the top 25, and that's right where he went in this particular fantasy draft. The fact that he went ahead of a guy like Andre Drummond 2 picks later, that's the thing to me where I get a little bit crossed up. I can actually, by the way, understand him going ahead of Clint Capella, believe it or not. Capella is a worse foul shooter than Gobert. He didn't block as many shots as Rudy last year. He's never going to be a feature point in that Houston offense where Gobert, if he stays healthy, could actually do a little bit more on the offensive side. And they desperately need him on the floor. Maybe this is the real key. Gobert is going to play probably about 5 minutes more per game than a guy like Clint Capella. But he's not going to play more per game than Andre Drummond, a guy who's shown himself to be very durable, who also has free throw shooting issues, but crazy strong defensive stats and ridiculous NBA leading type rebounding numbers. Plus, apparently, he's learning how to shoot and he passes. So between the durability stuff and just the stat set things, I think I would lean towards Andre Drummond over Gobert if just given this sort of head-to-head battle. But in terms of, guys that went in the second round last year that didn't perform as well, that are falling a little bit, I don't mind getting a guy like Gobert in the third round somewhere. So by that account, you're fine. And certainly for Jonas, who had to make this pick here at 25 and wouldn't see another player until pick 48, it's not like he could wait on any of these guys. It's hard to make back-to-back picks and understand that you're not just going to have to go get the guy you were looking at. Still, I'd rather have Drummond. I know, slightly fewer blocks, but just overall, to me, kind of more fun and safer. Gary Harris at number 26. He's another guy coming off a fantastic season last year. He was number 34 on a per-game basis, but 67 games played, and that's not unusual for him. He tends to miss time here and there with little nagging groin things or ankle things or calf things. I don't think he's going to be a super durable player, and for me, this is also a little bit early on the Gary Harris thing. I think there are safer plays at this spot, and I'm looking at Harris more towards the end of round 3 to create more of that value again. But, like we just said for Jonas, this is Alex. He's not going to see another pick until number 47. So if this is the guy that he wanted, he certainly isn't going to be there in 21 picks. Andre Drummond at 27, I think that's pretty reasonable. Clint Capella at 28, that feels fine to me. Miles Turner at 29, this is earlier than we're seeing him go in most drafts. This is, another situation where it looks like Kyle just wanted his guy. But he might have, believe it or not, he might have still been there at pick 44 coming back. We're seeing Miles Turner go closer to 45 to 50 in a lot of fantasy drafts. So this does wipe out a little bit of that buffer. Devin Booker went at 30. He's a guy that's been falling after the hand surgery news, which is good. He's not a guy that I generally end up with in 9-category leagues. He was number 48 last year, and he played in only 54 games on top of all of that. Doesn't do much defensively, doesn't shoot the ball well, very high volume from there, high turnovers. The assists not as high as they should be, given the massive turnover numbers. I'm not that excited about Devin Booker, but he's going to be the man in Phoenix, and so you're getting at least a safe fantasy play there. But he's just, he's sort of not my cup of tea. But if he is, then this is not a terrible spot to get him, because he was going about 5 to 10 spots earlier before the injury news. You guys know me. I hate to start my league with an important piece on the bench, and there's a very real chance that he misses the first couple weeks of the season. Bradley Beal at number 31. Really nice safe play here from the Welsh. Beal has been very good for a couple of seasons running. He was able to sort of survive all the whatever in Washington last year. He played in all 82 games. He was top 40 on a per-game basis, but much, much better than that by totals. And I think he's probably the one Wizard who doesn't get severely negatively impacted by the addition of Dwight Howard. So at 31, this is a very reasonable grab. I have no problem with it. Not a guy that I'm targeting, but I like this pick just in terms of its sort of safety. I got Kemba Walker at 32, which I have to admit surprised the crap out of me, because he was number 28 last year. He played in 80 games. It doesn't look like the Hornets are actively trying to move him anymore, and he's just, he's a pillar of safe fantasy value, and I think it's going to get better with Dwight Howard gone. I don't see a reason why he should see much in the way of drop-off, so to me, this is a guy who's an easy top 30, and the fact that he fell to me at 32, that was an easy pick. Even though I already had two Kyrie Irving and LeBron James, I probably needed a center here, but I couldn't give up something that was, there's never no such thing as a sure bet, but pretty close. Draymond Green went at 33. That's about where he's been going this year. He certainly coming off a down season. I thought last year there was an opportunity for him to sort of push back ahead, but the end of the story is that these Warriors are just tired, and so this is a pretty normal spot for him. LaMarcus Aldridge at 34. Yes, he's a guy that should definitely see a tick down this year with DeMar DeRozan in town. He was number 18 last year, but I don't see that happening again. 30s feels like a pretty reasonable middle ground for him. Kyle Lowry at number 35. He was number 29 last year, and his role with Kawhi versus DeRozan, not that different. He stayed healthy through the year. I think this is a very safe play at 35. I like it. Team Bogman. Nice value. And Marc Gasol at number 36. He was a guy last year that on a per-game basis was number 42. That's probably likely to stay pretty close to that mark. But Seth wanted himself a big man, as I probably should have done, because he had Paul George and Russell Westbrook. He knew that a guy like Gasol wasn't getting back to him, and when your next pick, as we've said, he had another one back-to-back, but the next pick for him was going to be at number 60. Then you're in a very different class of center. So you have your choice here of Marc Gasol or Al Horford or maybe Nick Vucevic. Or maybe John Collins. I guess he's going in that range right now. But if you don't scoop up one of those guys, and certainly they weren't getting back to him, then you're down into that next grouping of centers, which is like the Steven Adamses, the Jonas Valanciunas, the Julius Randle, the Brook Lopez, the Yusuf Nurkic. It's a pretty big drop-off from Marc Gasol to those guys. So while I don't necessarily agree with Marc going at 36, I certainly agree with Seth getting his center here before you get into the really clunky ones, because they're coming, and they're coming quick. All right, I think that'll about do it for today's podcast. We'll put a pin in this thing. We'll talk about the next few rounds on tomorrow's show, when we also catch up with Mike Pellichet of Bourbon Street Shots. Once again, a massive thank you to Mike Bossetti, his debut run here on Fantasy NBA Today. Remember, the Hoop Ball Draft Guide is $3 off with coupon code NURSE, N-U-R-S-E. Nick Nurse is the full name, but the coupon code is just NURSE. Go to hoop-ball.com, click on the Draft Guide tab, and buy it for $3 off the listed price, because the Brewski 150 will be yours in the Draft Guide on October 1, in addition to all the other good stuff. I don't think I mentioned any of it earlier on today's podcast, but it's just awesome, and it's so thick and dense with goodies. The Draft Guide's got the player profiles, the position breakdowns, the punt strategies, the head-to-head strategies, the playoff schedules. Oh my goodness. It has ADP reports coming soon. They're not in there yet, because frankly, it's too early to care what direction a guy's ADP is moving, but that's always my favorite. That's coming in October as well. Get the Draft Guide now. The price is only going up on a weekly basis. The closer we get to opening day, the more expensive it is. Get it now for $3 off with coupon code NURSE, and you'll be thrilled, especially when the B150 becomes yours on October the 1. I am Dan Besbris for Mike Bossetti on today's episode of Fantasy NBA Today. Have a wonderful Monday. Again, back tomorrow with Mike Pellichet. The fun continues. We're breaking down mocks. We're talking to guests. This is the run-up to the start of the NBA season, and we are enjoying every second of it. So long, everybody.
This has been a Hoop Ball presentation.